What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode. And today we are talking about the industry of building surveying. Now, why is this important? Well, as I've been speaking to one of my own coaching clients in the last couple of days, we were talking about a building project that he's thinking of embarking on. And the very first port of call we said was building survey. Get a building surveyor on the project right away and just get an assessment of the existing building. And that is, it's your first port of call when you start any kind of a project. You want to know where you stand. Is the building in good condition? If it's in poor condition, how bad of a condition is it? All of that kind of stuff. Now, I'm actually bringing a building surveyor who I've worked with many times, Krystyna Rawicz. And Krystyna, she is both a chartered building surveyor, she's also a chartered project manager, and she also has a business that goes into sustainability, and they do energy audits and all of this stuff. I'm working with them already, and I think this is going to be a very helpful episode for you guys. Now, before I go into it, I have to explain there's been a bit of a mess by myself today. I don't make mistakes on this that often, but today there's going to be a bit of a sound quality issue with this episode. I started the recording, and before I realized that I actually had the volume turned down on one of the microphones. So for the first 10 minutes or so, the audio is pretty poor. And then Krystyna's microphone is working perfectly. My own one is still a bit poor. So apologies, guys. It's been a bit of a disaster trying to put this episode together. I've discovered that there's different frame rates, and so the thing starts going out of sync and stuff like that. I got a phone call in the middle of it. Then I had visitors interrupting. So it's been a bit of a disaster. Please bear with it. I think Krystyna has some really valuable information. And one in particular, I think that you're going to find very valuable is last week's episode. I talked about the BER and in the UK, the EPC, and the fact that the standards are increasing. And if you want to rent your property, you're going to have it at a certain standard. Well, Krystyna confirms in this episode that it is coming to the Irish market. Now, so you'll have to listen out for that. But she says it's definitely coming, and it's part of the EPPD. I'll let her explain all of that. We talk about adding value to your property, using grants to go and do all of this kind of stuff. So I think you're going to find a great deal of value. And so without further ado, please, my conversation with Miss Krystyna Rawicz. Krystyna Rawicz, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here at last.
Yeah, it's taken a while to go and coordinate all of our efforts, but tell us, Krystyna, in terms of, I'm going to have introduced you, but people would like to hear it in your words. Can you give us if you're pitching a client, what would you say in, kind of 30 seconds? What would you say is your...
Will do. So I'm a chartered building surveyor and a chartered project manager. I worked initially in the UK, came to Ireland and worked for Hamilton Osborne King, now Savills, for 7 years, heading up their building surveying department, and then set up on my own in 2000. I've run that business, KRA Visionary Project Partners, as a building surveying and project management consultancy since then, and in 2018 we set up KRA Renewables to help our clients in sustainability in the built environment. And that spans everything from renewables assessments to energy audits, ESG, etc.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm familiar with you from doing schedules of dilapidations and things like that. But do you do domestic work, things like that?
We do a little bit of domestic work. It wouldn't be our main area of focus, although we've always done some domestic work. But where we're getting involved now more is retrofit, and particularly retrofit at scale.
Yeah. I was thinking that would be on in fact, I have it on my notes to ask you, because the retrofit plan, the national plan, it's a very ambitious plan.
It is 500,000 homes by 2030, and I think everybody and his brother would say that we're really struggling to make inroads into that target at the moment. And the big challenge is that we, the cost of doing the retrofit generally doesn't make sense unless you're also doing something else to the home. So if you're extending and renovating a house generally, the retrofit and the grants really contribute well and it works well. But if you go into a home where the householder wants to stay in place, you're doing a minimal retrofit to get to B2, the work that has to be done generally costs so much and causes so much disruption that it's very difficult to get buy-in.
Yeah, I know, it's funny, I've spoken to a couple of coaching clients that I have, and they're looking at this. In fact, one of them has gone and set up a solar panel sort of retrofit business in order to jump on board all of this. Mm-hmm. But we were kind of talking about, there's all these grants that are out there, but the grants don't cover the cost. They just, make it, I suppose, a small inroad in the cost. But you need to be writing a check yourself for a sizable sum, really, don't you?
That's right. Well, I think the maximum grant, if you did absolutely every measure and you did it through the Community Energy Grants system, where you're getting a bonus this year for heat pump installation as well, would be around 30 to 35 maximum thousand. Right. Probably 28,000 in reality for most homes. Now, your retrofit could be costing you 100,000. So that's a big gap to bridge in the absence of any real green finance available currently.
Yeah.
Now, if you were able to borrow that, say, in a way such as, let's say in Italy, they set up a scheme whereby you borrowed it from your local credit union equivalent, but it was a government-backed loan, and then you pay it back through your payroll, and it's taken out before tax. So that sort of approach, I think, could work very well, but I do understand that they've run into a few problems with that scheme, with people doing works that they shouldn't have done.
There's always somebody going to fiddle the system in some way, and then it ruins it for everyone else.
Yeah.
Tell me, Krystyna, before we get into, because we're getting straight into some of the important stuff that I want to cover today, but before we do, let's just backtrack a bit. You mentioned you were in the UK before, but with your name, you're Polish originally, is that right?
My family's Polish.
Right.
So my parents are both Polish. They were both taken out of Poland separately and by different routes by the Soviets during the Second World War.
Oh, okay.
They were both children. My mum was 8 and my dad was 10. Both spent a couple of years in Siberia under different circumstances.
Wow.
And managed to leave when the Soviets changed sides and joined the Allies. There was an armistice in Russia which allowed Poles to leave but didn't facilitate them. And both of them actually left with the Polish army in exile. So my mum in a Polish orphanage in exile, and my dad with his mum, he became an army cadet at the age of 12 in Tehran.
So Tehran? Wow.
Tehran, yeah. After leaving the Soviet Union. So long stories. Ended up in the UK at the end of the Second World War, around 48.
Wow.
And actually planned to go back but didn't because of the stories that were coming out as to what happened to people who went back at that time.
Wow. Yeah.
So stayed, settled, and I was born in the UK as a sort of second generation.
Okay, yeah. Interesting. It's funny because Lucas, who works here in my office, he's Polish as well, and when he saw your surname, he was immediately like, it's funny how people, and there's a huge Polish population here in the UK.
Well, there is, and when I came to Ireland in '94, I was very exotic because I had a Polish surname, and I think the only other Polish person I met in the first few years here was Andrzej Wejhart, the architect, and his wife, and we got on very well. But that all changed obviously with the boom and with the large influx of lots of different nationalities. So we have to say we're a different country now, a completely different country.
It's amazing. I was just thinking about this the other day. I mean, when I was leaving college back in 97, kind of 95 kind of time, I can remember you were going out into, by that stage it had already begun to change. But growing up, there was only Irish people. You only ever had Irish friends. You had nobody that was foreign. I mean, except maybe in school there might be, you might have met the odd person whose father was an ambassador or something like that. But that was the extent of it.
Yeah.
Now my kids are in school and it's every nationality. It's incredible how Ireland has changed. And of course, that's one of the reasons why we have such a housing issue now, is that the inward migration and the demographics are just so strong. I think we're by far the strongest country and fastest growing country in the EU.
Yeah, it's interesting that we're bucking the trend, and in many ways that bodes well for us, because the biggest problem in so many countries now is the ageing population and the fact that there isn't sufficient tax base or people base to support that ageing population. Whereas we are at least a decade behind the UK in that, and now we have lots of immigration from cultures which traditionally have higher rates of birth than we have moved to, and perhaps lower marriage rates and so on. So you're starting families at a younger age, all of which means that we may perhaps avoid the elderly crisis that is facing so many countries.
Well, hopefully, or else we just kick the can down the road a little bit.
That is possible also. That is possible also. But it does, of course, bring in its wake huge problems, and we saw something similar in 2005 and 6 when we had, Eastern European construction workers building the peripheral housing estates to be occupied by Eastern European construction workers. And we're in a different game now, because most people are not going to be able to buy any houses that are built, so it's rental that we're looking at.
It has changed, and that's creating problems in itself, because the scale of building and the scale of the rental issue that we have. I mean, we're building housing, and we've rented some of them. We've done the scheme where you bring in a big investor from one of the big institutions, and the problem is that since the interest rates have shifted, that has no longer that whole business model that was working beautifully is now broken, and the guys are not looking for the same. The rates basically that they expect of a return have completely changed, and so all of a sudden there's a spanner in the works, and I don't think that is going to be as viable an option going forward, unless there's some way that the government can support it with tax breaks or something. And of course, as soon as you mention tax breaks for developers, it's kind of like, what,
Yeah, and of course we all remember the, tax breaks for holiday homes, and then the swathes and swathes of holiday homes in wild and remote areas that are empty for most of the year, and tax breaks for commercial units as well, if you remember that one. Yeah, so I was victim of that one as well, and still have a vacant retail unit, which is likely to remain vacant.
How did you end up in construction property? Going back to this is it's a question I like to ask, because a lot of the time parents are the reason that people end up in, but sometimes people kind of choose for a different reason. So so
mine was completely different. So I was the first person in my family, very small family, first person to go to university, and I actually was fortunate enough to get a place at Oxford. So I went to St Catherine's College, Oxford, for 3 years, and I did a degree in modern history and economics, and then left as a graduate not knowing what I was going to do. Decided that I wanted to travel. Found a teaching degree that would give me teaching English as a foreign language, but I was a bit slow in all of this, so I had a year to kill between finishing university and starting the teaching degree. Travelled for a bit, ended up back in Birmingham, where I'm from, in the spring. Got a flat. In those days you could get a flat without a job, but got a flat and then needed money to pay the rent, so I got a job in the local job centre, a temporary job. And while I was there, a job came in for Birmingham City Council as a trainee graduate building surveyor. So there were two jobs. There was trainee graduate housing manager and trainee graduate building surveyor, and the building surveyor role paid more, slightly more, $6,250 a year. And I applied because it paid more than I was on in the job centre, basically. I went for a first interview, had a good first interview, and by the time I went for the second interview, had really got interested in this idea that you did day release for 5 years to get a degree in building surveying, that it was a professional qualification, and got the position. And in fact, I was the only person ever taken on the graduate trainee building surveyor scheme in the council. But I was with them for 4 years and then left and joined the private sector before I finished my degree and qualified and became a chartered surveyor in the UK. So it was very much chance.
And what's interesting is that chance, you now have, have a business and people working for you and everything like that, and it's not a path that was charted like by choice back in the early days.
Well, I think actually on reflection, when I look back at it, the one thing I learnt in the job centre was I did not want to be sitting behind a desk all day, every day. So that was a really interesting learning. And I've said to all my kids, if you get work experience of any sort, do it. It doesn't. If you hate it, you will at least learn what you hate, what doesn't work for you. So it was really useful to know that about myself. And actually what I love about what I do is that you're not desk bound all the time. You might be at the desk for, a few days on end writing a report, but you're dealing with everybody. I always said I wanted to work with people, and I kind of thought maybe community work, which I'd done during holidays, maybe social work, something like that. Actually, I work with people every day of the week, and I work with people from the guy on site who's pouring the concrete in the hard hat and wellies to the CEO of a multinational. And actually people are the most important part of what we do. What we do is deal with bricks and mortar, but an awful lot of what we do is helping people to make their way through complex problems. And you know what they are.
Yeah, that's a really good way of articulating it, because a lot of people, certainly a lot of people would be there, they want to get into property, or they want to become like a financial trader or something like that. And they like the idea of it, but as soon as it involves like spending all day sitting on a screen or something like that, what I've been saying all along is that the property business is a people business, because whether it's, as you say, the people that you meet and clients and all that, but like if you're looking to buy a property or sell a property, there is a whole face-to-face negotiation that goes on there. There's like understanding the motivation behind buying property or selling a property, and so it's very much people skills and how you can manage and navigate your way around people's different sort of ideas and all that kind of stuff. So it's a great way of articulating it there. And I say that because starting your own business is never easy, and I just wanted to kind of move to the point where you decided to set up on your own in 2000, you said, was it?
2000, yeah.
So we're about 20 years plus into your business.
Nearly a quarter of a century,
wow, yeah.
Which is terrifying and great. So I was working very happily in Hamilton Osborne King, which was a much smaller company then than it is now, HOK. Yeah. So at the time, I think when I joined, we had 3 offices, Belfast, Dublin and Cork. And in the Cork office, people still went home for lunch when I joined the company. But it was, it was a fantastic introduction to the country, great people, really good way to meet a wide variety of clients across the country. And in fact, one of my earliest jobs was for Bank of Ireland bank branches across. I'd got a third of the branches to do across the country. So I was driving to places like Callan and Cashel and all sorts of places that I perhaps wouldn't have got to for a lot longer had I not been doing this work. So it was a different world. In those days, branch managers still lived above the branch in many cases, and it was a different island. But I really enjoyed my time at HOK, would have probably stayed there for a lot longer, but I felt that I wanted to have ownership of something. And that kind of wasn't on offer at that time for me in the company. So I took the decision to move on and set up on my own with some fear, to be honest.
Yeah. I was going to ask, that's my next question, is like your mindset, because you've got a job, pays the bills, it does all of that, and suddenly you're talking about throwing all that aside and pressing ahead. What was it like starting?
It was scary. I remember my very first day in business, 1st of October 2000, and the first job I had was a residential survey in just beside the Phoenix Park. And I remember driving there and carrying my ladders, which used to be much heavier in those days than they are now, and thinking, is this it now? Is this what I will be doing? And
have I bitten off more than I can chew?
and obviously there was also a status thing. I was an associate director in the company, and there was certain status with that, and certain way that you were reflected in other people's eyes. And Yeah, no, I was very, very fortunate because very early on I got some great instructions. I got the instruction to project manage what was then the Aircell fit out in Sandyford, and it then became Vodafone. So, if you remember at the time, that was the biggest letting in Ireland, and it was a 38.5 million fit out. So, and it was amazing. It was an incredible instruction to get, and it sort of had a 3-year time frame. So I went in very cheap, but it gave me a real backbone to the business for 3 years that I could build on and start recruiting people in and so on. And got a bit of work with the religious orders, and that was great as well, historic buildings and project management for historic buildings, and then slowly built up a client base and a reputation.
It's interesting, you mentioned the historic buildings. I was just speaking to a coaching client of mine on Friday, and it's a long story, but basically himself and his wife they've inherited an old building, and I mean old. I was looking at the heritage report, and this building was built in 1664, so it's very old. And we were talking about, like, what did you do with it? And I was like, wow, when you get into heritage buildings and a monument, it's like it's a national monument, this building and stuff. And we were chatting about it, and I just said the first thing is get a building surveyor on board, because you need to know health and safety, you need to all of this kind of stuff. And that was the first port of call that we kind of came up with as the sensible move to make, because they'd already looked at various things in the several years ago. But current status, where are we today? Building surveyor. And so the business that you're in is pretty much the first port of call that a lot of people will go to in a situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes they don't. And that really surprises me, because, it's probably the biggest single investment people make is buying a property, whether it's residential or commercial. And to do that without really understanding what it is that you're buying, or even, let's move to something much simpler, taking a lease, a tenant taking a lease on an office building. I was just talking about this with somebody last week. Almost never are we asked to do a building survey. We might be asked for a schedule of condition, but almost never are we asked to do a building survey or to assess what obligations the tenant's going to have under their lease and what it might cost them on exit. And most tenants come out very, very surprised at the end of the process and say, well, why on earth should I have to pay that? That's not fair. And, if you're acting for the tenant, it can be a hard job to take them through the documentation that they signed maybe 25 years ago, maybe 35 years ago, and show them why they're now responsible for perhaps a very significant bill.
I know we would do a lease with somebody, and then you've had a great working relationship with them and everything's gone fine, and they're leaving the building in ostensibly good condition. It looks nice, but they've been there, say, for 15 years, and so naturally there is wear and tear, and there's various, and it almost you feel like you're going to end up coming to blows when you're saying, like, it's actually about 150 grand that you're going to have to pay to kind of, like, bring it up to standard. They're, what, like, we're leaving, like, and you want us to pay 150 grand. So it is it is painful, and that's why what you're saying is absolutely, just know what you're getting involved in right from day one. And it might be, like I've said actually to people, that when you buy, you're over 18, you're now responsible legally. If you're buying that building and it has some sort of a defect, health and safety puts you in completely at fault if anything should go wrong. And that is a criminal matter then, if something God forbid was to go wrong. But for example, not knowing that you had asbestos in a place, like, that's no defense when you're sort of standing in front of a judge and somebody's, like, suing you. So this is the thing, or electrical fault, or old plumbing that is, the old lead pipes. The first house that I lived in with my parents was filled with these lead pipes that were like 100 years old. And of course we know now that that's not a good thing, but at the time.
Actually, I think the councils across the country, I believe, are doing a lead pipe replacement scheme currently. I saw something about it in the press, and about time, you might say, but we do still have a lot of lead pipework, Victorian and early 20th century, because it was the way that we brought water into buildings until very late in the 20th century. And I probably wouldn't, if I was personally looking at it, wouldn't worry too much at my age, but if I had young children, then certainly I would be concerned.
Sorry, that's our bell there ringing in the back, in case you're wondering.
Something you mentioned there earlier about the property that dates back to the 17th century. So I suppose something that's worth saying is that, older properties are inherently sustainable because the embodied carbon was embodied in them a long time ago. Yes. And therefore, the more we can do to keep existing building stock in use and in active commercial use, the better. One of my big concerns, and I've been involved in a few working parties in Society of Chartered Surveyors on this, is the vacant properties that we have up and down the country in towns, large towns, small towns and large villages that are vacant. And you can go to, let's say another town in the Midlands, and you will see Main Street having the Centra or Spa, the betting shops, the hairdressers and barbers and the charity shops, and often very little else. There is an absolute fantastic potential there for residential across the country in the places where people live, and particularly for housing for elderly persons for whom you don't have to create a 10-minute town. You already have a 10-minute town on your doorstep with the doctor and the church and the park and everything else in close proximity. But at the moment, our statutory approval system mitigates against those conversions. Now, we've got a fantastic Living in the City initiative in Dublin, and I've worked with that team, and it's been very successful, where they work as one united group to help you overcome the conflicts between, say, conservation and fire safety, or fire safety and disability access, or whatever it might be.
There's a lot of conflict there, though,
isn't
there? Yeah,
there is, absolutely. And as a practitioner, you're dealing individually with the different departments, none of whom really care about the requirements of the other departments, because their obligation is just to make sure that their requirements are met. But it makes it very, very expensive. Let's say you're the owner of that property in the Midlands that might be worth at best 250,000, a mid-terrace town centre, retail ground floor, currently vacant, and vacant upper floors. If you've got to spend 15,000 before you start on statutory approvals, which might be negative, then you're on a hiding to nothing. The property will continue to be vacant. So we need to bang our heads together and find solutions for this. And
it's all these vested interests and stuff like that. That's the biggest issue, isn't it? It's like everyone's got their own fiefdom, and it's like, as long as I'm protecting my area, that's all that matters. It's a big issue, all right, because I can remember I had a beautiful house on Herbert Place.
Oh, yes.
One of those ones overlooking the canal. And I think we did a sort of a heritage report on it. I think the house was built in 1845 or something like that. I can't remember exactly the date, but it was something in around that. And I remember saying, right, what I wanted to do was to completely restore the building. I wanted to get all of the staircases all back to their original sort of carvings and everything like that. I really wanted to do a beautiful job on it. And but then came in the requirements for fire cert and all that kind of stuff, and they told me that in order to do what I wanted to do, I was going to have to put in fire lobbies and all of this kind of stuff. And I can remember being so frustrated, saying, like, what I'm trying to do here is like restore the building, like, and I'm being told like all of this stuff has to be done. So in the end, I can't remember what exactly was the outcome, but I sold the building, decided like it was just too much hassle to kind of try to go down that road.
Yeah, and it's a tricky one, because obviously nobody wants to be seen to be skimping on something that has a potential fatality risk. Yes. Having said that, I don't know if you could tell me when the last time somebody died in a fire in an office building in Ireland.
Yeah, it's a good point.
You know,
Actually, we do here. Like we would have a fire drill once a month, I think it is, or something like that. And just everyone, you see them all sitting, standing outside the building. 5 minutes later, they're all back at work, and that's the end of it.
Yeah.
But,
and obviously regulations have developed over, over the centuries, really. The Great Fire of London was the start of building regulations, at least this part of the world. So there were very valid reasons to want to have regulations that made properties safe to live in and to be in, and that's what we all want. But sometimes the regulations are anomalous and make no sense, but the people who look at the applications have no wiggle room to work with you, which is different in other jurisdictions, I think, where perhaps building control, for instance, in Northern Ireland will work with you on a reciprocal basis to find a solution that satisfies them where it can't quite meet regulations. And it's more of a cooperative approach than our approach, which is submit it, see if you can satisfy the person looking at the application. If not, it's sent back and refused. It's a different system.
It's a bit more flexible.
Yeah, and I was on the building regulations advisory body back in the 90s when I came to Ireland, actually largely because I was a woman and one of not very many women in the industry, and they needed more women on government boards. But I had a significant number of years in that role, and have seen our system go from building regulations with a fire safety requirement to then the introduction of the requirement for protected structures legislation, to then the requirement for disability access certs, to then the requirement for BCAR. And it's all bolt-on. Yeah. I think if somebody was to start the process today, day one, it would be different. And in our world where we're looking at what we have to do for sustainability, I think we need to be stepping back and looking at things de novo. And that's tough. That's a really tough gig. But I think it would be warranted to do that in conjunction with what's coming in terms of new directives from Europe, in terms of needing to look at LCA and accounting for carbon in construction, and everything else that's coming down the tracks.
It's gotten really complicated. I was saying just on a recent podcast that you see that in the UK they have the EPC and we have our BER. And if you're renting a property, the new rule from April 25 is that it must be a C-rated building or above in order to qualify for rental. And so that's going to mean that huge numbers of people in the UK are suddenly not qualifying. And so that's hand in the pocket, invest in adding in whatever it's insulation, solar panels, windows, whatever it might be. Do you think that there's a risk of that coming in here? Because I personally think that is how the government will ultimately meet some of their objectives and promises that they've made for carbon, emission reduction and stuff like that.
Yeah, so it definitely is coming here. It's coming in via the EPBD, the European Performance of Buildings Directive, which is currently still being negotiated in Brussels. It's been going on for quite a while, but they are progressing on it. All the indications are we're not going to go to C. It's probably going to be an E or an F rating initially.
The UK, basically.
Yeah. But what we do have to prepare ourselves for is that is also going to mean rationalisation of the way that the assessments are done across Europe. And the indications are that our BER ratings will go down. So, for example, you may have a property that is currently, let's say, C1, and your BER cert will expire after a certain number of years. And when you go to have it done again, because the rules will have changed, it might be now a D. Yeah, might not be. It might only go down 1 or 2 points, but this is the strongly anticipated outcome, which
is what we've seen. If you look at if you buy a refrigerator in DID Electrical or one of these places 10 years ago, it was an A-rated refrigerator. Today, that same refrigerator is like an F or something like that.
Yes.
And so I can see the way it's going. It's going to disappoint me because my new home that I just moved into is A1 and I don't want to lose that. So it'll be interesting to see how long I can keep my A1. But I get the point. The thing is what I've been saying all along is that you've got the stick and the carrot approach. And the carrot is the grants that are on offer. There currently isn't a stick. But I think in order for the government to meet all of the promises, they've gone to the COP conferences and they've made promises around emissions and all this greenhouse gases. The only way is going to be by bringing in the stick and saying, right, no, any building that isn't below a certain level, that's it, you're off the rental market. Now, of course, that's going to have a negative impact on the rental market, which is probably the big difficult bit that they're trying to kind of come to grips with, is that we already have a major problem. You don't want to take, kind of 10,000 houses off the market just because of some BER cert. But you can see the way it's complicated.
Yeah, it is. And, I think there's also a big question mark in my mind. So the current government policy, let's stick with residential, is to get to a B2, minimum B2 rating for 500,000 homes by 2030. And that's not an aim, it's not a target, it's a commitment.
Yeah.
But that does mean that in many cases people are aiming for B2 only and not higher. And the grant system will not give you more if you get it to an A rating than to a B2 rating. So particularly for those responsible for public monies or for, charitable monies, it's very difficult to make the argument to actually do a bit more work at the property and get it to an A rating whilst you're there doing the work. And that's a real problem. It is a real problem.
I have seen that the banks at least are, showing up on this as well. I've noticed that certainly the last time I looked at mortgage rates for AIB and stuff, I noticed that there was a 0.5% improvement if you were into the A rated.
Yeah.
Which is a big, 0.5 point on a mortgage. It is definitely an incentive.
Yeah.
Whether or not it's going to fund, the works that you have to do to get there, probably it doesn't. But at least it's dipping the hat, I suppose, too.
Well, certainly if we move to commercial property, the banks have, I think, certainly Bank of Ireland has made a decision that the B2 is going to be their minimum for lending. And most investors now want to see not just the path to B2, but the path to NZEB. So NZEB, near zero energy buildings. And we have to get used to the term ZEB now because ZEB is coming down the tracks very, very quickly. So zero emissions, that's going to be, a requirement very quickly.
Yeah, and that's the biggest thing. I mean, some of the questions I wanted to cover with you today are really, what should the commercial landlord be looking forward to? And I suppose looking forward is the wrong way because it's pain. There's some serious investment needed. We've been looking at our buildings, and some of ours are, of a certain age that they're not easy to bring up to those levels commercially. I mean, if you have a bottomless pit, you can pay for anything. But if you actually want the rent that you're collecting for the building to make sense based on the amount you paid for the building and the amount that it's sitting there, with the new works done to it, the investments don't always stack up. And now, to make matters worse, the banks have become kind of a little bit more reticent at releasing funds and stuff. And they have these, we've noticed that banks are saying, we want your portfolio to be much, much greener. But when it comes to a choice of paying down the existing debt or leaving some of it out there in order to make these improvements, they tend to prefer the pay down of the debt. They're not interested in, allowing you to make those investments. It's supposed to come out of your own pocket rather than out of theirs.
Yeah, and I suppose there's a dividing line between perhaps the larger funds and institutions which have very clear mandates, and they've set their, they've nailed their colours to the mast. They've said what they want to achieve, whether it be, net zero by 2030, which seems to be a very common aim, or some are 2035, but they have the ability to put a plan in place, generally because they're very high yielding assets that warrant the work being carried out to them. The big challenge is going to be a step down from that with the portfolios and the individual buildings, which, exactly as you say, finance is a big question mark. Having tenants in with leases where you can't disturb them during the term of the lease is a big question mark. So the starting point, I would say, is very often to carry out two things simultaneously, an energy audit and a sinking fund assessment, and to incorporate into the sinking fund assessment at appropriate timeframes for the building fabric the upgrades that are highlighted in the energy audit as being the way to get to where you want to get to. So, for example, we did this recently for a building, a office building in the Munster region, and we looked ahead. In fact, it was an unusual one because the building only has an anticipated 10-year remaining life because of where it is and what's happening in the area, and it's quite an old asset. But we basically have mapped out what it makes sense to do and what it makes no sense to do within a 10-year life. For other buildings, for actually one here on East Point, I've looked at a 30-year time frame and, looked at, say, the facades in the context of that longer time frame, and at what point do these facades become economically end of life, and therefore it makes sense to replace them. Before that, when does it make sense to perhaps do the roofs and the roof insulation and put solar PV on the roofs? And try to stage it so that you have a plan for the building. And obviously things change and technologies change and that can be updated. But I would certainly be saying to anybody who's buying an asset to make sure that as well as your technical due diligence, you have a sustainability due diligence that maps out how you're going to be able to get the building to a level that will mean that it's not left as a stranded asset.
Well, that's the word that I was just on the tip of my tongue, was stranded asset. Is that the unfortunate reality for a lot of people is that those plans that you're talking about, whilst they make total sense, the economics just don't currently stack, and so it is quickly becoming a stranded asset. And for anyone who's not familiar with the term stranded asset, that is effectively where the work that you need to do to get the building rented again is greater than the value of the building in its current situation. And so nobody's going to fund that. You don't have the funds in your own pocket to do that, and therefore you're stuck. And nobody wants to buy it because of the cost of this, except maybe if it's in a particular location, somebody with lots of cash can go ahead and buy it. But from an economic standpoint, most landlords they use borrowed funds in order to do this, and so it has to stack. And a lot of the time it doesn't.
Yeah, and again, just if we move to government obligations, so, the Climate Act has said that we will have 30,000 commercial buildings retrofitted to a minimum B2 by 2030, that any state body cannot rent a building below B2 rating, I think, currently, and I think by 26 or 27 it's net zero.
I think it may be even different. I think that certainly government entities that we're working with cannot rent a building below A3.
Okay.
But they can renew a lease as long as it's B2.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's even more stringent, and that, given the amount of state leases that we have, I think people have not really started to even get their heads around what this is going to mean. But it's going to mean that when your lease is coming to an end with that state entity, you have to either be 2 years ahead of time offering them the path to you upgrading the building or jointly upgrading the building. If they really want to stay there, there may be some incentive for them to contribute. Or you need to think about what you're going to do with your building.
Yeah, and that's it, where it comes into change of use potentially or whatever. You did mention earlier, and I think that's where a lot of this makes sense, is taking one of our buildings out the window here. You're looking at a building that's 2 floors high, and if you have to do a huge amount of work to get it up to, say, an A1 standard or an A3 standard or whatever, it probably makes more sense, given the increasing densities, to actually knock the building down or try to extend it. I know knocking a building down is also problematic now because of the embodied carbon and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, it can make sense in some circumstances to strip a building back to shell and core, so you keep the structural frame but you remove everything else, and you've still got your concrete floors and your concrete roof and your structure.
But in terms of adding investment value, you're stuck with the same.
But you may be able to add, depending on the structure of the building and how it was designed, you may be able to add extra floors, particularly in lightweight construction. And we're looking currently at an apartment development built in the 70s, and a floor can be added to that in lightweight construction that will solve some of their problems in conjunction with energy upgrades for the development. Yeah. So that's something that we should certainly be looking at, densification of use as part of what we do in terms of sustainability. And for me, I think demolition is an absolute last resort. Sometimes there's going to be no other option, but in many cases there are other options. And
we certainly, using this as an example, like we've looked at this, and the problem is a lot of the time it's the decisions that were made way back, when the building was built 20 years ago. So we have got piled foundations in the cases of some of these buildings, and they were designed to take 2 additional floors at a later date, and so we've at least done that. But a lot of people, when they're at that point, it's like, well, how much extra is it going to cost to put in that, thickened, it's going to cost an extra 100 grand or whatever. Oh, well, no chance. Like, let's just keep it. Because you're not thinking ahead 20 years. You're thinking, I need the money now. Yeah. And so in our case, we were able to do that. But there's all these complications that people don't realize, because I've added floors to buildings. And when you first of all, you have to extend your lift shaft, which usually isn't too difficult. You can do that with steel. But the width of the staircase is the problem, because as you add extra floors, the capacity of the building, the number of people goes up, and then suddenly the width of the stairs for fire escape actually becomes a problem. Yeah. And I can remember not being allowed to add 2 floors, being restricted to 1 because of the width of the staircase in the fire stairs. And that was a real... And
I've been in a project where we had exactly the same thing happen. We weren't actually adding any extra floors. We were extending the building horizontally, and there were new staircases going in serving the horizontal extensions that fully met all building regulations. And exactly as you say, the fire cert was conditioned with a requirement for a 100mm increase in the width of the stairs, and it simply couldn't be done because it was a concrete core. 2 concrete cores, and you'd have had to demolish the building to do it. So that building is still standing there empty 5 years after we went through this process.
5 years.
5 years, yeah.
That's the thing. I mean, this is the thing that people don't realize, that you have to be so careful as an investor, because, and I've made mistakes over the years as well, where you buy something, and I won't say you buy it on a whim, but you buy it making certain assumptions. Yeah. And those assumptions, if you don't test them very carefully before you're committed, you can find that later that they don't hold water, and suddenly you're stuck. I bought a building with a partner in 2005, I think it was, and we had to hold on to that building for about 10 or 11 years empty before we were able to sell it. And because our assumptions were wrong at the outset, and then we were on the back foot when we realised we made a mistake, and we tried everything to find a tenant to go in. Nobody wanted to touch the building. Yeah. And so we had interest carry costs, all this kind of stuff. And in the end, we sold the building for 20% of what we paid for it. And it was absolutely awful. But that's, what got me all the grey hair and things like that.
But actually, that's interesting. I mentioned earlier, around the same time that you bought your building, perhaps 2007, I bought a retail unit off plan in one of these tax incentive areas. And actually it would have, had the crash not happened, there was to be 400 homes built on that side of the town, and it would have been, there'd have been a market for those retail units. There's the assumption. However, in this case, the building had been empty, and I thought, okay, there's apartments overhead. I'll do the conversion to residential, which you could do if you remember the planning exemption for vacant commercial buildings. I did the liaison with the local authority. It was a large unit, and I was going to convert it into a very large one bed because I thought, let's not skimp and make it 2 tiny units. Let's make a nice big one bed and overlooking a river, really nice property. I then went and got costs for it, and the costs for doing the conversion, using a builder who was very familiar with us and had priced it pretty well at cost. They hadn't built in the normal profit margins. It was going to cost 128,000. Now, apartments in this development at the time were selling for 160,000. So obviously there was absolutely 0 sense in sinking that money into.
It's just, bad money after bad, exactly.
Yeah, and this is the problem I think that we're going to come to with retrofit, because, in Dublin, very often the retrofit makes sense, and, you've upped your BER rating to either a B2 or, something higher, and you've increased the value of the property. But if you're in the West or in the Midlands, and you've a home that's not going to ever be worth more than 250,000, and it's worth 250,000 now, it's very difficult to find the argument in the absence of grants that will cover a very significant amount of the cost to do the works. Now, our system currently does offer 80% grants for people who are in fuel poverty, and that's great. But I think that higher funding level needs to be broadened to take into account the realities of economics around the country.
I think what's happens is all of these commitments that are made, they're made in the cold, light of day, and they're not really thought through. And then, here we are now, 500,000 homes by 2030. There's not a chance that we're going to make that. And nobody is kind of frantically kind of out there kind of panicking about this. They're kicking the can down the road, it seems to me. It's
Well, I'm not sure that's quite true. I think there are people in SEAI, Sustainable Energy Authority Ireland, who are spending a lot of time, energy, legwork trying to find solutions. I had a great conversation actually at the Irish Green Building Council event last week with somebody from SEAI who's this is their area of operation, and I raised all my arguments as to why our current system isn't working and raising the models that I thought have worked elsewhere, and she was very aware of all of them, had looked at all of them, and was able to tell me why they hadn't worked for those governments.
Right.
So, I think that there's potential for something called the energy sprung model, which has been used it originated in the Netherlands. It's been used in various European countries and in the UK, whereby your retrofit is done in a factory off-site, and the on-site period is perhaps 5 days to 2 weeks at the end of the project, and the contractor comes to site with insulation panels for your wall and roof already made. They put them on the outside of your building. The on-site operation involves taking out windows and replacing them and doing the air tightness, and there's a pre-packaged energy plant room which has your solar, the battery storage and other equipment for your solar. It has your heat pump in it, and that comes to site and is just bolted on the side of your home and connected to the services within your home. But I'm told that we don't have the economies of scale to make. The even more interesting thing with that model is it's based on a long funding plan where the energy savings pay for the cost of the works over perhaps a 30-year period. So your energy bills stay the same as the occupier, but each month as you pay your energy bills, you're chipping away.
That's the way it should be done, but I think the biggest a lot of the time the problem is that government parties are only in power for 4 or 5 years, and then it's the next election cycle is the only thing that these people are kind of concerned about, whereas 30 years is the way that this would work. There's a few things that I'd like to ask Krystyna before people leave. First of all, and this might put you on the spot a little bit, but best advice that you've received in your career to date?
Oh, yeah. Best advice I've received in my career to date I didn't take, which was a client of mine, a real character, who told me, never borrow any money from the banks. Fund anything you do in your business yourself, which is what he did over a very successful career over many decades. And I didn't follow his advice. But that is a great piece of advice if you can do it.
Retrospectively, yeah. I mean, I wish I had done the same as well. And tell me this, in terms of, resources that you're very learned about all this kind of stuff. I mean, what are some podcasts, resources, whether it's books or anything? Is there anything out there that you would recommend that people pick up and read?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd recommend anybody who's got even a passing interest to join Irish Green Building Council. It's very cheap for individuals to join. It's not expensive for companies to join. And you then get access to all of their training resources, which are relatively low cost for members or free, entirely free for members. And they offer the opportunity to do various trainings, such as in LCAs or... all the different things that are out there that we need to know about, they have training schemes for. Embodied carbon, residential, the home performance index, etc., etc. So,
and this is coming down the tracks, whether or not you're interested.
It is.
It is guaranteed to knock you off your chair at some point.
What I say to the younger people in the companies that we have is, this is your entire future. You as a professional in the built environment, whether you're in property, whether you're in renewables, whether you're in building surveying, project management, you need to know this stuff. And the people who are coming out of college now already know it as they're coming out of college. So if you want to keep any sort of competitive advantage with them in your career, you've got to upskill yourself. And it's behoven to yourself to do that for yourself in your career. There's loads of resources out there. I think there's more events we could go to than we have time to go to. There's more books out there than we could ever read. But just start somewhere and start asking the questions.
Good advice, guys. You've been warned. Krystyna, final question. And you mentioned college students coming out and stuff like that. So let's turn back the clock to young Krystyna at 20, leaving college. What advice, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give yourself?
That's an interesting one. I think the advice I would give myself is to follow my gut instinct more often than I did during my career, and to find an environment which fit for me, which is what I've now done and created for myself.
Okay. So earlier finding that environment.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Good advice. Krystyna, if anyone wants to reach out, connect, hire you.
Yeah, absolutely.
How's the best place to find you?
Well, you can phone me, 087 968 0106. Always happy to take a call. And also email Krystyna, KRYSTYNA @kra.ie. And we have a team of people that if I can't help you myself, somebody in the team will be able to assist.
Well, I will put those links and that phone number, if you want, into the show notes.
Yes, please.
Great.
Yeah, and always happy, even if somebody just has a question and they don't know which way to go with something, happy to have that conversation and help you find a direction.
Brilliant. All right, Krystyna, such a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks.
All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do hit like. It's going to help the video and the algorithm and the channel and everything. And I'll really appreciate if you do that for us. Please also, if you haven't already, please do subscribe. I'm going to point you now to my interview with Raquel Aparicio, who is an interior designer. And she's going to talk about the importance of interior design when you're doing projects, even as small as a HMO. I hope you enjoy.